Matthew 24:34 says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." Now, Jesus himself said that, and many people think Jesus is referring to 70 AD and the destruction of Jerusalem. Is that correct? Let's take a look. This is the Bible Sojourner, where we discuss issues related to the Bible, theology, and culture. I'm your host, Peter Gaiman, professor of Old Testament and Biblical Languages at Shepherd's Theological Seminary. Shalom and welcome. Thanks for joining. Welcome back, fellow sojourners. It is good to have you along for the ride again today. We have a very promising episode ahead of us, and we are going to talk about Matthew 24:34 and what does this generation mean? What do all these things mean? It's going to be an exciting discussion ahead, and I just have to tell you, I've had so many people ask that I would do a video on this subject, and in fact, back when this was an audio-only podcast, we actually did a few discussions on Matthew 24, but since no one listens to the audio-only anymore, plus the quality got a ton better after the years went by, so that was years ago, and so I wanted to update a few things and actually include some more evidence, even that I just found recently in reading through some dissertations. And so I'm excited to kind of put forward some material on this. And I would say, I don't think I need to convince you that this is an important discussion to have, but at least in my understanding of people embracing postmillennialism, this is one of the definitive issues that makes people jump ship to postmillennial eschatology because of the preterism of most of the Olivet Discourse being fulfilled in 70 AD. So this means that this is a very crucial discussion to have. This is extremely crucial. And I would actually say, I think on the surface level, it seems to me at least that Matthew 24:34 is probably the best proof text that a preterist or post-mill would have. And of course, this episode is going to assume you have some background knowledge on postmillennialism, premillennialism, preterism, and things like that. But basically, in general, when we're talking about this, most of you know this, but just in case this is your first video watching, preterism embraces a belief that the Olivet Discourse, most of it or all of it, in many cases, has already been fulfilled. It was fulfilled in 70 AD. And then a futuristic approach would view this as taking place in the future still. Okay, so how is that going to be understood? And there are other viewpoints too, an idealist approach, which is a lot less common, where it takes it more symbolically and whatever. But what I want to really focus on is why this is so crucial, and that's because of the explosion of postmillennial resurgence. All right, I think we've talked about this before. It's just very, very common. Everybody acknowledges this, whether you're for it or against it. Everyone acknowledges that postmillennialism is on the comeback. And so, a lot of people look to Matthew 24:34 saying, hey, this is as clear as it gets. Jesus says that these things are all going to take place within this generation. Therefore, we need to understand that we should expect all these things to have taken place in 70 AD. Okay. And experientially, I would say that most people, this is my experience as well as many of the pastors and fellow Christians I talk to, most people have been very influenced by Durbin and Damar. So Damar is a huge influence on Durbin, and Durbin, his series that he preached through at Apologetic Church, they put it on their YouTube channel and all of that, and that was very, very convincing for a lot of people on social media. I would say one of the primary things that people list as why they're postmillennial now is because of Jeff Durbin's sermon series on the Olivet Discourse. And I've reviewed some of that in the past, like I mentioned, audio only, but I want to do more now on this, just with this video at least, and we'll see in the future. I'd like to do some more things as well. But I just acknowledge that they're a very strong influence in the world, social media wise. Apologia has, hundreds of thousands of subscribers. And so through their influence, many people are hearing this saying, oh, this makes a lot of sense. This is so powerful, but there's no pushback and there's no alternative view given. And I think if you examine a lot of the arguments that they give, they are quite lacking, just honestly. And so I think that we need to do that. So to kind of start us off, I want to kind of just play one of the videos that Apologia puts out. And so this is a very short clip. It's just about 2.5 minutes. And I want to play it through in its entirety and just kind of give an example of why this is becoming more and more popular. Okay, so this is a video where Durbin, it's a shortened video of, I think it was a couple hours long, the episode that they had done, but it's basically talking about, did Jesus give a false prophecy? Okay, and the name of the video itself is, did Jesus make a false prophecy? And it's a radio highlight, so it's just a little highlight here. And let's hear what Durbin has to say for why he believes what he believes about the Olivet Discourse.
You've got atheists like Bertrand Russell and popular atheists today that will actually go to the Great Tribulation passage, and they'll say, look, this is pretty explicit. Jesus says here that this generation will not pass away until all these things be fulfilled. Yeah. And they're right. Jesus did explicitly teach that, and he was talking to that generation. It's such clarity that Jesus has here in the Olivet Discourse about this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. It's such clarity that you even see well-known Christians like C.S. Lewis in his essay called, I'm sorry, forgive me here if I get this wrong, I think it's called The World's Last Night. He talks about the fact that what Jesus has here in the Olivet Discourse, he says, is certainly one of the most embarrassing verses in the Bible. That Jesus clearly knew no more about the timing of his coming than anybody else. And in terms of this is clearly someplace that Jesus got it wrong. You know who said that? C.S. Lewis.
Ouch.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis said that. That, look, this is clear. Jesus clearly, he made a mistake here.
I wonder if he put together the implications of that, given what you just said about Deuteronomy 18.
Well, then that's the key issue. So why is this important? It's important because, look, Jesus is the Messiah. He's a prophet from God. Jesus can't give false prophecy. Jesus does give prophecy in the Olivet Discourse concerning their generation. He uses the near demonstrative when he uses it, this generation, the generation he is there speaking to. And all throughout the Gospels, Jesus uses the terminology, this generation, numerous times. And who's he talking about when he uses that terminology? The generation to whom he's speaking, the people who are in front of him, this generation. He uses it about them. He uses the near demonstrative, this generation. He's talking about things that they were expecting, and Jesus clearly bookends that prophecy in Matthew 24 with this generation will not pass away till all this takes place, and then he finishes the discussion, and this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. My point is look, you get this wrong, and you give unnecessary ammunition to the unbelievers, the skeptics, the atheists who just want to trash the Bible. When you put the Great Tribulation future to us and out of Jesus' context, you are giving unnecessary ammunition to the unbeliever.
Okay, now notice how he ends that and says you're giving unnecessary ammunition to the unbeliever. Actually, I should say first, I'm not sure. C.S. Lewis, he's saying, well, C.S. Lewis said that. Well, listen, I have huge problems with C.S. Lewis. I mean, he had some crazy beliefs. And I think Durbin would acknowledge that as well. So I don't think saying, well, C.S. Lewis even thought this is that strong of an argument, really. I don't think so, at least. But regardless, notice his main argument is emotional there. It's saying that if you believe in a futuristic view of the Olivet Discourse, you're actually giving ammunition to an unbeliever to say that, hey, well, actually, I don't, it's interesting. I think I just thought of that's completely illogical, because if you say that it's futuristic, you're saying that it hasn't happened yet. So you would be making the argument that Jesus did not say it should have happened and didn't happen. You're saying that Jesus said it was going to happen in the future. So that's really weird that he would argue that that gives ammunition to the unbeliever. The only way it would give ammunition to the unbeliever is if Jesus prophesied that it was going to take place in 70 AD and it didn't. Okay, so interesting. I didn't think about that before, but the reason I played that clip was because actually I just wanted to show that his argument is very emotional in the sense that, hey, this is an apologetic. We can use this, and it's very appealing to people because it's empowering in one sense for somebody to just say, oh, this actually already happened. Yeah, it happened in 70 AD. And let's be honest, most people are not going to be able to, understand, the history of 70 AD. Most people don't even understand, and you've all seen those clips, right, where Americans are walking around and, you have some late night show host ask them who won, the Revolutionary War. And the people say, I think it was France, or who won the Civil War? We did. It's just like, okay, people have no idea about history. The odds of somebody, very few people are actually even going to know the details of 70 AD. So if you would know just a little bit of Josephus, just by being excited about history, you can say, this looks like this, and so it's fulfilled. Boom. And then nobody's going to be able to stand against that, right? But just because there's an emotional appeal to the argument, a simplicity to it, doesn't actually mean it's correct. And of course, I would argue that that shouldn't be our priority, right? Our priority shouldn't be what preaches best or what is a, easier way of understanding the text. We should argue what is correct. How should we understand this? So we definitely need to look at this. I would say out of, all the emails and comments and text messages and things that I get, I probably have more people reach out about this passage than any other, just because so many people use this as a default hermeneutic. For example, I remember having a conversation recently with a pastor who somebody in his church was becoming post-mill, and they met with him, and, the conversation went like this, well, this generation means this, therefore everything else falls into line with this, right? And there are some big problems with that we'll get into. So all I have to say, though, is that a lot of people do use this as a hermeneutical grid for understanding their theological system. It's not how it's supposed to work, but we will talk about that to begin with, okay? So why is this an issue? What are actually the interpretive issues? So in Matthew 24:34, when it says this generation shall not pass away, what are the main interpretive possibilities? So there are actually more than just three, but I'm going to give three because I think they can be viewed as subsidiary views, okay? So the main one in line with what we're talking about today, and it's probably most common on social media and everything, is that this generation refers to the generation that Jesus is speaking to, and gives an insight that temporally this is going to be fulfilled during this 40-year time span. Okay, that's usually the first view that is brought out. The second view is that this generation is referring to a future generation that is going to experience all the events that are listed by Jesus in the Olivet Discourse. That would be the second view. And then the third view is that this generation refers to the rebellious, sinful, Jewish nation as a whole. And what's interesting is, as I was studying other things, I actually ran across some very old adherents of this view. One individual was Nathaniel Holmes in 1653, so way before Darby. Nathaniel Holmes was actually viewing it that way, and we're going to circle back to that about why he viewed that. And yeah, interesting. I was researching something else, and I ran across him in a quote, and I was thinking, wow, that's fascinating that way back in the 17th century, way before Darby, you had people that viewed that in that capacity. So those are the three main views. We're going to talk about it. But first, we need to ask the question, where is the starting place for this discussion? Like, how should we go about this methodologically? That's really important. One of the things that I want to try to communicate is not just what I believe, but try to key people into the process of how I'm thinking. And I appreciate that people can find the errors in how I think, and they help refine me. But then also, I would also challenge if people aren't able to give a solid methodology behind their thinking, then they need to jettison the result of what they're thinking. So the first thing to point out, which is a huge problem in my mind, is that preterists want to default to Matthew 24:34 being the starting point of the whole discussion. Okay? So like I said, so many times this conversation revolves around this idea of, well, we know that this generation means this, therefore everything else in the Olivet Discourse has to revolve around that point. Okay? And, that is insane methodologically. Okay? And, people might try to rationalize it by saying, oh, we have the clear interpreting the unclear or something like that. Well, again, huge problems with that. And, if you think about the context of Matthew 24, almost everybody preterists included. In fact, Jeff Durbin, when I went through and watched his sermon series years ago, I was pleased to see at least that he gave lip service of the fact that Matthew 23 is actually the background and starting point of the Olivet Discourse. And so he just, didn't do the right things with it, but he acknowledged that Matthew 23 was the foundational starting point for Matthew 24. I think most people understand that to be so, and so we just have to understand Matthew 23, and then that helps us understand Matthew 24. So arguably, the whole section goes from 23 to 25 in Matthew, and so and by the way, there are other sections in Scripture, Mark 13, Luke 21. We won't go into those. Matthew's my priority right now. And so we need to understand that the context, rather than allowing the starting point to say, well, we know what this generation means, therefore then we can go to everywhere else. That's not a sound hermeneutical practice. In fact, the clear context of Matthew 24 and 25 is the second coming. Okay. In fact, the disciples are literally asking about, the sign of your coming, right? So when will you come? Like when is all that you've been talking about, including what you talked about in Matthew 23, by the way, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. When is all that going to take place? And so the disciples ask that question. Jesus talks about that. The terminology is there. The end will come. So will be the coming of the Son of Man, etc. So, if you're going to talk about clear interpreting the unclear, obviously you can't just say, oh, this generation clearly means this. Therefore, we have to take the coming of the Son of Man and make it something different than it is elsewhere in Scripture. Okay, that's kind of a ridiculous thing. And just think about it like this. A lot of false doctrines do come out that way. Okay, think about I have a gentleman in our church group that I've been working through, and in his family, there's a very strong belief in works salvation. Okay, I know it's sad, and there are people who teach works-based salvation, not salvation by grace through faith. And so one of the ways that this is argued is you go to the book of James. That's one of the solid places, and you go to James 2:24. And in James 2:24, you read, "You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone." So very clear verse there, right? James 2:24 says, we see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. Boom. Now we can go back and interpret everything in light of that, because that's a very clear verse. You see how silly that is? That's how false doctrine gets brought into the church. So you don't go to Matthew 24, verse 34 to start the discussion. You start in a context, right? We understand that in other areas, just in eschatology sometimes, all sides get this wrong a lot of times. I'm talking about, when people make errant arguments for premillennialism, postmillennialism, and amillennialism, whatever camp you're part of, the propensity is to try to argue for the position, not to argue correctly, right? So we just need to methodologically understand you can't just pick and choose a verse in the middle or at the end and then say, okay, now we can march through that. That it's not a key, right? It's not a key that you can now unlock everything. It just doesn't work that way. And it can help you observe things probably, but in this case, you want to be very careful about doing that. So I think we understand that in other theological realms, but eschatology is the same way. And in Matthew 24:34, that's not the starting point. You can't claim that is the place that's so clear, okay? And I think if you consult all of Matthew, you're going to come away with a much different understanding of this generation, which we will talk about, okay? Now, I would also point this out, and again, I did that series on Revelation and the dating of Revelation, and did a lot of historical analysis there, and tried to show that there's not much of a divergent opinion in church history. There's minimal one. There's divergent opinion in every Christian circle on everything, but it's pretty minimal. By far and away, the majority of the opinion of the church is dating Revelation, later. And similarly, similar point, I should say, it's not weighted to the same degree as, in the interpretation of Scripture and exegesis. But, one of the things that Durbin argues in his video, and DeMar argues, and many of the Preterists argue, is that, Matthew 24:34 is so obviously talking about Jesus's generation. How could we miss this? This is the key forever. Well, if that was the case, if that was the case, if it was so obvious, why did the early church almost unanimously, and we're talking about like second, into the third century church, why did they hold to Matthew 24 as a future occurrence, right? And so now the first one that Durbin and DeMar usually reference is Eusebius, right? But he's much later, at the end of the 3rd century into the 4th century. And so Eusebius does seem to have more of a preterist understanding of Matthew 24, but we're talking about early church history, we're talking Irenaeus, we're talking about Hippolytus. There are a lot of individuals, Tertullian, who take Matthew 24 as describing a future reality. And I just thought I would give some of these. So this is Irenaeus, who everybody hates, or I should say all non-premillennialists hate, because he is very, very premillennial in his eschatology. And so this is what he says, and this is a quote from Irenaeus against the heresies, right? And so he says, moreover, he, the apostle, has also pointed out this which I have shown in many ways, that the temple in Jerusalem was made by the direction of the true God, for the apostle himself, speaking in his own person, distinctly called it the temple of God. And so he's talking about 2 Thessalonians 2 and how he believes that that's going to be a future occurrence, okay? And so he talks about that. And so he says, let's see, by whose directions the temple which is at Jerusalem was constructed for those purposes which I have already mentioned, in which temple the enemy shall sit, endeavoring to show himself as Christ, as the Lord also declares. But when ye shall see the abomination of desolation, which has been spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let him that readeth understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and he who is upon the housetop, let him not come down to take anything out of his house, for there shall be then great hardship, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, nor ever shall be. Okay, so Irenaeus is quoting that in the future, right? So obviously he's talking about a future temple because he's writing at a time when he knows there's no temple sitting in Jerusalem. So he's saying, yeah, in the future, this person who's endeavoring to show himself as Christ, the enemy is going to sit in that temple, right? So, don't think that this is a dispensational innovation to say that, there's belief that the Antichrist will come and sit in a temple, that there's going to be a future temple, etc. Right? So this is Irenaeus, 2nd century Christianity, okay? So this is a very common view among, the believers during that time period. And notice that he quotes then a significant portion of Matthew 24 as applying to the future, okay? So I think that that's one of those realities where, again, we just need to acknowledge if people thought that Matthew 24 was already fulfilled in 70 AD, now that doesn't mean that they didn't say that there weren't parts of it fulfilled. Actually, Christians throughout history have acknowledged that, some of the signs that Jesus have talked about were fulfilled in a certain capacity for that. The wars and rumors of wars, of course, the conflict, the first Jewish war would fulfill that. So that's not to say that there weren't certain aspects there that were, acknowledged to be true. But many of these things, beginning in the abomination of desolation and following, were for a future time period. That was the default position of the early church. And Hippolytus, he's I wrote down his commentary there. We don't have time to look at it. Tertullian in Against Marcion 439. What do all these have in common, by the way? They're really focusing on not just attributing the Olivet Discourse to the future, but they are also attributing the Old Testament background to the Olivet Discourse. And this is something that a lot of people miss. And so this is when we're talking about the starting point for this discussion, one of the things that we need to acknowledge is that, the early church, and we also ought to follow this pattern, the early church was constantly putting the Old Testament background to the Olivet Discourse. In other words, Jesus wasn't just making things up. He wasn't just coming out with new things. He was repeating older things, or he was expanding upon things that had already been revealed in the prophets, okay? And so here's something from Tertullian, and I'm just going to read the quote at length because it's really helpful to show the background to the Olivet Discourse that he understood, okay? So he says, likewise, ye, when you see these things come to pass, know that the kingdom of God is nigh at hand. This will be the great day of the Lord, the glorious coming of the Son of Man from heaven, of which Daniel wrote. Behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, which is a reference to Daniel 7:13. And he says, and there was given unto him the kingly power, which in the parable he went away into a far country to receive for himself. It's a reference to Luke 19, I believe. Leaving money to his servants, wherewithal to trade and get increase, even that universal kingdom of all nations, which in the psalm the Father had promised to give to him. Ask of me, and I will give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, which is Psalm 2:8, right? And then he says, and all the glory shall serve him, his dominion shall be an everlasting one, which shall not be taken from him, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, Daniel 7:14. Because in it men shall not die, neither shall they marry, but be like angels. It is about the same advent of the Son of Man and the benefits thereof that we read in Habakkuk, thou wentest forth for the salvation of thy people, even to save thine anointed ones. In other words, those who shall look up and lift their heads, being redeemed in the time of his kingdom. Okay, so that's a section from the 5 books against Marcion in his Latin Christianity volume. And one of the things about this is, so he's talking about in the Olivet Discourse. This is so cool. I actually didn't know this before. I should have known it. My church history professors are going to smite me for not knowing this. But what was so cool in reading through Tertullian, in tracing his understanding of the Olivet Discourse, is that he made a very strong apologetic argument. So remember what Durbin said is like, oh, this, you're giving ammunition to the unbeliever if you say that the Olivet Discourse hasn't happened yet, if you say it's in the future. Well, the way Tertullian used the Olivet Discourse is talking about the future, about how Jesus has explained what is going to take place. And then he argues that, well, because if you know the background of Marcion, one of the heresies that Marcion was guilty of was making a distinction between the Old Testament God and the New Testament Christ. Okay, so he was saying that the Creator God was basically evil in some capacity, and the New Testament God, Christ, was far different and better. And so what Tertullian was arguing is that you have Jesus being the same as the Old Testament God because his instruction and his prophecy in the Olivet Discourse was the same as what the Old Testament God had said. And so notice the key component of his argument is that, because Jesus is prophesying the Olivet Discourse, that which agrees with the Old Testament, then we know that Jesus and the Old Testament God are the same. Okay, that's what Tertullian is basically arguing, and it's really kind of neat. And so, again, this isn't, Tertullian would probably scoff at what Durbin said, saying like this is the most embarrassing verse in the Bible. I mean, Tertullian is using this text, this passage, to argue that the Old Testament knows what it's talking about, and to argue for, the unity between the Christ, Jesus, and the Old Testament God, right? And so it's really kind of neat, and I think it's actually kind of ridiculous to argue that using the Olivet Discourse in a futuristic manner is not a good apologetic. I mean, that's what the early church did all the time. I remember talking to my colleague and friend, Mike Vlock, and he was telling me that even in the struggle against Gnosticism, the church often used, and Michael Spiegel also has something on this in his book, the Second Century Eschatology book that just came out, and we interviewed him if you want to look at that video. But just talking about the early church using a premillennial eschatology to combat Gnosticism, this kind of view that the physical material is bad and the spiritual is good, and things like that, the Gnostic reality. And so premillennialism was a strong apologetic for that. And so all that to say, when we think of the starting point of this discussion, that the Old Testament is the real background to this issue. You have to know Old Testament eschatology, and if you know what the Old Testament teaches about the coming of the Lord and what the expectation is for Israel and for the second coming in specifics and the signs that are going to accompany that, you're going to not be surprised by the Olivet Discourse. It's going to sound very, very similar and familiar to what you already expect. Okay, so the starting point isn't you just go to Matthew 24:34. That's a suspect methodology. The starting point is actually to have a trained mind on the Old Testament, because Jesus is assuming that you're going to be able to pick up those dots. And then after you know your Old Testament, then you can pick up and continue the story in Matthew, which is a very Hebrew gospel, Hebrew-oriented gospel. In fact, when you take Greek, one of the things that you observe, if you ever take Greek, maybe you don't, but I'll just tell you this just in case anyway. But when you take Greek, you quickly understand that there are Greek constructions in Matthew that match with, the Old Testament, and it's now not saying that it's like revolutionary, but it's very obvious. Most people recognize that Matthew and Revelation are two books that mirror the Hebrew style in quite significant ways, and part of the reason for that is because of the dominance of the Old Testament themes within those books. All right, so that's part of it. I think Matthew must have also just had that style as well. Okay, so assuming we have a Old Testament context down, we understand, the prophets and what they have foretold about the return of the king, as it were, and what should be expected with regard to his coming to claim the kingship and all of that. Well, assuming that, there's also a context of the Olivet Discourse, which is very, very helpful for us as we go through. And so in Matthew 24, verse 3, I'm just going to bring it up here on the screen. We're told that he sat on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" All right, so notice that he's talking, that there's basically two questions here. Some people say three. I don't know. I'm not convinced. I think that there's just two. I guess I'll see if I'll remain convinced. If somebody can convince me there's three. I think that there seems to be two. And it's, when will these things be? And then what's the sign of the coming and the end of the age? All right, so if you break those things up, there's actually a context to each of them, okay? And that's not surprising, but basically it's not, let's put it this way. It's silly to think that the disciples just came up with that question randomly. Like if they had a magic 8-ball and they said, okay, let's see, what should we ask him? Boom, okay, randomly, let's ask him about this. No, actually, like I said, everybody acknowledges that this conversation stretches back into Matthew 23. And in Matthew 23, we'll go into this a little more later. But in Matthew 23, the discussion of the rejection of the Jewish leaders, and then how Jesus actually told them, "Your house is left to you desolate, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" And so, the disciples obviously thinking about that would say, well, when, and there's every reason to believe that that would have been associated with the second coming of the Lord. So when they say, "Tell us about your coming, the sign of the end, you're coming," we need to know about this because we're assuming it's going to be soon to help us understand those things, right? So the question goes from the disciples, and they seem to be locked in on this whole conversation, which then extends well into 24 and into 25, okay? And then also their discussion is about the sign of your coming and the end of the age, right? Now, I've talked about this a few episodes ago when we talked about the end of the age and the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and how a lot of people say that's when the end of the age took place. And so I don't want to redo all of that stuff. All I'll do here is just repeat the fact that in Matthew 13, the discussion there parallels, with exactness the phrase "end of the age." So I'll just bring that up on the screen so that we can see that, or I'll read it to you too if you cannot see it. But in Matthew 13, when Jesus is telling parables of the kingdom, he's talking about the end of the age, right? So he says, "The field is the world, the good seed is the sons of the kingdom, the weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so it will be at the end of the age." So in other words, either Jesus, I'm trying to say it the best way I can, either Jesus is talking about two different things, which he's talking about the end of the age, which it would be really kind of ridiculous, I feel like, for a teacher to label something the same way and then, expect his students to think they're different. But I think it's most consistent to view Matthew 13 when he's talking about the end of the age. It very clearly here he's talking about, the end of it all, right? The the gathering of the wicked, the gathering of the righteous, and even in verse 47 to 50, he's talking about throwing the evil ones into a fiery place, in a place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Well, most people are going to take that as a reference to eternal punishment, right? So this does seem to have indication that the end of the age phrase here, which is found again in verse 49 of chapter 13, it does seem to indicate that these are coupling the phrase as kind of a technical term, the end of the age, with that coming of Christ and the establishment of his kingdom, okay? Now, as I've mentioned elsewhere too, if you go through Matthew 19, Mark 10, Luke 18, there are parallel passages, but if you go through those and understand the age to come, that's a reference to the next segment, right? Because eternal life is associated with that, and you also have the regeneration in Matthew 19 associated when Christ sits on his throne, judging the 12 tribes of Israel, etc. So all that to say is that by the time in Matthew 24, by the time we get to Matthew 24 and the disciples are asking about the end of the age, there is a huge theology in Matthew already about the end of the age. And it includes the judgment of unbelievers, gathering them together, and the gathering of the righteous to reward them. Obviously, the reward nobody could ever say there was a reward that happened in 70 AD, right? That's all judgment. So you have to kind of allegorize that if you're going to try to apply those in different places. But there's judgment, not just any judgment, but eternal judgment, right? The gnashing of teeth concept of hell. And so you're going to have that mentioned. You're going to have the return, and eternal life is also associated with that close of the age. And so all those things coupled together help us understand when Jesus is making a reference, or when the disciples are asking about the end of the age in Matthew 24:3, that's the context, okay? So that would already give us, at least at the very outset, an expectation that what Jesus is going to be talking about is not going to be 70 AD. It's going to be what he has already been talking about in Matthew, right? Looking ahead to the future about when the king comes in his power to reign, okay? I mean, I think that makes most sense. So that's a brief look at the context, and now I really want to examine the views in detail and give you kind of how I view this. And again, we're basically going to be looking at 3 views, but there are subsidiary views of all of these, but I want to kind of work through them and give kind of the positives and negatives of each, as it were. And so the first one that I want to talk about is this generation means the current, 30 to 40 year generation that Jesus is speaking to. And, I think this is the least likely view. And the reason for that I will explain, but I should note that the way preterists present this, this is the obvious view. But again, as I mentioned, it's not so obvious, not in early church history. And then I think there are a lot of theological and grammatical considerations, exegetical, that would lead us not to do that. But DeMar, in his book End Times Fiction, says, every time this generation is used in the New Testament, it means without exception the generation to whom Jesus was speaking. Okay? And Hank Hanegraaff, Jeff Durbin, they both emphasize that. In fact, in the Jeff Durbin video, you remember hearing that Jeff Durbin says the near demonstrative is used, the near demonstrative. And so I want to talk about that a little bit, okay? Because people think that's such a strong argument that the near demonstrative is used, therefore there cannot be any way that it would not be a reference to that current generation, okay? Now, I just want to, approach this linguistically for a second, okay? So a demonstrative pronoun, so this is a near demonstrative. I know you didn't want to come to grammar school, but this is a near demonstrative. That, if you use that in English, obviously, that would be a far demonstrative pronoun, okay? So they have them in Greek, they have them in Hebrew. They're a little more flexible in Hebrew, actually, but in Greek, they're used quite often, and most languages probably have the equivalent of a near and far demonstrative. But let's think about linguistically. A demonstrative pronoun can refer to a physical referent, or it can refer to a logical referent, okay? So I just think that this is important to point out, just because, this isn't a slam dunk argument that preterists think it is when they say, oh, it says this generation, you have to. Okay, so physical or logical. So you can say that I'm looking at this person, right? I'm talking about this person with a physical referent right in front of you. But if you're telling a story about somebody, you can say I'm talking about this person, the person that I'm talking about in the story, a logical referent, not a physical referent. And I think the best example of this in the Bible, actually, at least, I don't know, there's probably somebody else give me a better example, but I think in John 4, you have such a cool example of this. And I think the demonstrative pronouns are great in John 4 with Jesus talking to the woman at the well, right? So remember, the context of John 4 is, "Sir, give me this water." Well, what kind of water is Jesus supposed to give her? Well, spiritual water. Well, in the context, beginning in verse 11 of John 4 here, it says, "The woman said to him, 'Sir, you have nothing to draw water with. The well is deep. Where do you get that living water that you were talking about? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock.' Jesus said to her, 'Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again.'" All right, did you catch the near demonstrative there? No, because you were falling asleep. But notice, if you're watching, I highlighted it on the screen here, "This water will be thirsty again." Okay, so he's talking about the physical water from that well. All right, so he's used the near demonstrative right there to refer to a physical referent. And then in verse 14, he says, "But whoever drinks of the water that I will give to him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give to him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." And the woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water." Now, you could take that. And of course, the context is so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water. If you just took that first part of the verse without the context, you would say, well, look, she uses the near demonstrative pronoun, and clearly Jesus had just used the near demonstrative to refer to the water. They're literally at a well, and the woman says, "Give me this water." So in any, fair-minded assessment, this was, one would easily be able to say she's just asking Jesus for water. It's almost like she lost patience, and she says, "Jesus, give me this water. Come on, I lost my patience." Well, obviously the context makes it clear that she's switched to a logical referent, right? So the exact same phrase, "this water," but she's switched, right? And it's actually within just a couple verses that she's switched. So I think this is a good example of the flexibility of demonstrative pronouns. And so in the context of Matthew 24, everyone says, well, he's talking to this generation. Well, in the explanation of the futurist camp, a lot of people would explain this, and I think it's a logical, reasonable argument. Okay, this is you just have to acknowledge that this is logical and reasonable. Is that if Jesus is talking about a future event, and then the very next, so he talks about the fig tree, for example. When you see these things, know that all these things are taking place. This generation will not pass away. Well, obviously, he's just been talking about a future event from a futuristic standpoint, right? So, hence, if he's talking about the future, he's already in a context for a conversation. So, a reference to this generation then would obviously be a reference to the logical referent that he's talking about, right? I mean, that's not rocket science. I think that makes a lot of sense. And so it's not the slam dunk preterists think it is to say, well, it's this generation has to mean this, right? I mean, you just look at Scripture and you can see that the near demonstratives, the far demonstratives have a variety of functions that way, right? So I think that that's important to acknowledge. And then so the main, well, that's one critique. Obviously, the slam dunk arguments for this generation aren't exactly the slam dunks that people think they are, but the other arguments against this viewpoint, the preterist viewpoint for Matthew 24, are actually positives for the other viewpoints. So we're just going to transition to the more likely views now. And that would be the future generation experiences these things. So as I already noted, if you're going to take the futuristic viewpoint in the Olivet Discourse, then it's completely reasonable to say that the referent there is to a future generation. So you're taking it a temporal mindset, and that this generation of Matthew 24:34 is a literary emphasis. This generation that is experiencing, these events, they will not pass away until all these things take place. In other words, it's saying in the future, when you get to this point, then you're going to, it's all going to happen so fast that this generation will experience it all. That would be kind of how it's understood. Now, the greatest evidence for this kind of futuristic view, this temporal futuristic view, are kind of the contextual clues all around it, right? So the abomination of desolation, right? The abomination of desolation, spoken of in Daniel, mentioned by Christ. There is no event in 70 AD which fits very well with that. There's obviously a lot of attempts to make it work, but I see no event within the 64 to 72 AD that would qualify with how Jesus talks about the timing of the abomination of desolation, right? Because the abomination of desolation has to take place as one of the significant signs, right? And in fact, even how it's mentioned, timing-wise, you have a very good connection in verse 15 to 16. It says, when you see the abomination of desolation, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So basically, there's a strong connection for when you see the abomination of desolation, that's your key to flee. That's your insight into to get out of there, right? And so there's not really any, we can do a special episode on that because there's not really any good alternatives for the preterist viewpoint for what the abomination of desolation is. If you include the evidence for Daniel as well as what Jesus talks about, it just doesn't seem plausible, right? And I know people are going to take offense at that. It just doesn't work. Just because you say something works doesn't mean I have to agree with you. All right, so that's one thing. The abomination of desolation doesn't seem to have taken place yet. In verse 21, we're also told that there will be a great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. All right, so, and again, preterists are forced to say this. I see it on social media all the time. They'll say something like, well, if you were a Jew during that time, you would agree with this statement. Okay, like, we're just playing some word games at that point, right? If you're saying that this is the greatest tribulation and there's never been a greater tribulation prior to this, and there will never be a greater tribulation after this, that's what the text says. And you have to basically say, well, it's just figurative because that's not true. Nobody objectively would say that 70 AD was the greatest tribulation. In fact, I was just reading a different book on the history of modern Israel, and the author was basically, you don't even have to agree with his statistics, but he said in his book that he, counting up the historian figures, the way he attributed the death total in the first Jewish war, which is the one that centers around 70 AD, and the second Jewish war, which is the Bar Kokhba rebellion in around 132 AD, so 70 versus 132, is he actually counted more casualties in the 132 conflict for Israel. Now, I'm not sure if that's true. In my counting, I can't remember. I went back and counted them a long time ago, and I can't remember exactly what I came out with. All I remember acknowledging is that there was a lot of similarities between the two conflicts as far as casualties and death totals. I think I remember thinking 70 AD was higher, but this author said that 132 was more significant for Jewish casualties. And anyway, the big point being that it's weird that there's even a debate, right? It's weird that you think about all the Jews that have been killed and slaughtered, or think about the Holocaust, right? So it'd be very difficult to be talking to a Jewish man today and say, well, in 70 AD, there was a lot of people killed in this city, but the Holocaust, there were a lot of people killed all around the world in all these different countries. And so I don't see this as being a fulfillment of 70 AD. And I'll just, I know this is going to be offensive to people, but you kind of have to play a fast and loose game here where you're kind of doing what deistic evolutionist people do in Genesis 1, right? Genesis 1 says, this is what God did, this is what God did, this is what God did, literally this is what it says, all those things. And you kind of say, well, I know this is what it says, but it can't mean that because of a variety of things, right? So what's the difference? I know this is offending people, but I just think it needs to be said, is that why do we have license to say in Matthew 24:21, it says it'll be the greatest tribulation ever, but then it obviously isn't. So how are we to assess that, right? That's my question. And that's why we get, again, different theology variations when we don't allow the text to have the priority, right? So that's my advocation there for, is that a word? Advocation. That's my attempt to lovingly challenge my brothers and sisters who want that to be, fulfilled in 70 AD. Is like, can we really say that was the greatest? I mean, it wasn't objectively, but can we say that that was the greatest tribulation? Not even obviously not in the world, but even for the people of Israel, it wasn't. So it was definitely part of God's judgment. Let's be real about that, but it wasn't the greatest. Okay, even that aside, you just go down the list. There's so many of these, right? Probably the greatest one is that contextually you have the parousia, the coming of Christ being mentioned explicitly, right? In verse 27. In verse 27, it says, for as lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be, or so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So in other words, you have to, again, just jettison all the other Old Testament texts and New Testament realities that talk about the parousia, the coming of the Son of Man, and say, well, I know that there's always associated judgment and blessing with the coming of the Son of Man, but in this reality, we're going to say that the judgment takes place in 70 AD, and there's no blessing whatsoever, but we are going to just say that, this is what happens. And in verse 29 through 31, even as we go further, there's a further explanation for what that looks like. And there's these, the sun will be darkened, the moon will give its light, there'll appear the sign of the Son of Man. All the tribes of the earth will mourn as they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. That's directly related to Daniel. Nobody, I don't think, probably somebody debates that, but almost everybody acknowledges that the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds is a reference to Daniel there. And notice also that he sends out his angels in verse 31 with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end to another. Now notice that that's a direct, especially the trumpet call there, that seems to be a direct reference to Isaiah 27, 12 and 13, where it's a gathering of the Israelites so that's a blessing for them, right? So there was none of that in 70 AD. There was no gathering of Israel. There was just a scattering of Israel. But this coming says that, with the judgment, then there's also going to come blessing. The people are going to be gathered. Matthew 25 comes right on the heels of Matthew 24. And you would expect them to be closely related, right? You would, just thematically. But in the preterist viewpoint, Matthew 25 either is far removed from Matthew 24, like it's in the future, or for some reason, I don't know what Durbin actually believes on this, but I know DeMar basically believes all of Matthew 25 was already fulfilled. And so, again, I just think that that's indefensible. You just can't claim that. You can't make that argument, which is why he's a full preterist now and going crazy. But my goal is to defend against those kinds of things, right? And so it's one of those things where, there's just so much. There's so much involved in these, signs that you couldn't say that they were done in 70 AD. By the way, a word on the cosmic signs, because I know those are mentioned quite a bit. A lot of people actually, I hear this all the time, is that they say that the cosmic signs in the Old Testament were regularly written about by the prophets to just communicate the ending of a nation or whatever. And one of the things that I would say is that a lot of the example passages that are given, I'd be open to consulting other ones. I actually think it wouldn't be a problem if some of the cosmic signs appeared at the destruction of other nations. But a lot of the passages that they refer to saying, look, this was in the Old Testament at the destruction of Babylon or whatever, a lot of those I think are actually related to the day of the Lord. And so a lot of them, I would just say, yeah, we expect that to happen in the future still. So just because it was written about in the Old Testament doesn't mean it has happened yet. I mean, Babylon will, according to the futurist understanding, still be judged in the future, right? So all that to say that a lot of times when people say the cosmic signs are just, used in a way that they're used in a way to signal the end of a nation or whatever, I think it's pretty simplistic. I'd have to look at each argument that somebody makes, because a lot of those passages I would just take as futuristic, right? So again, putting all these together, there's just too much in Matthew 24 that doesn't work with 70 AD. These are second coming passages, and it really does. So if you think about it, obviously a preterist is mainly controlled by Matthew 24:34, and so this generation, it has to mean 70 AD. So let's get the other things to fit no matter what happens. But a futurist is trying to allow, the significance of what he's reading, the coming of the Lord, the abomination of the desolation, the cosmic signs, all those are things that you could not argue took place in 70 AD, or you could, but they're bad arguments. And so you would argue then, okay, because of those things, we need to understand contextually that Matthew 24:34 has a specific meaning in that context. Okay? That's typically how the futurist will understand that and interpret this generation to mean a future generation that experiences all these things that are talked about in Matthew 24. Now I want to talk about the third view, and that's that this generation is a collective reference to the nation of Israel's continual rebellion against God. So Israel is viewed corporately, and they are, referenced as this generation. And it's not a reference to a temporal time period as much as it is what Ryan Meyer says a qualitative view. And I'm going to reference his dissertation on this in a few places, just because I think he does a really, really good job. And his plan is to publish it. I think it's in the works right now to be published with SCS Press. So hopefully that'll come out soon. Looking forward to that. But I really think his research is really good on this. And basically his point in his dissertation, or how he describes things, is that you can kind of define the views into two parts, temporal or qualitative. Okay, so the temporal idea would be that this is a generation of a certain length, and the qualitative view is that this is a generation of a certain quality, whether that be sin or righteousness or whatever, there are just different views on this. And, it's interesting. You're not interested in this, perhaps. Maybe you are. But I used to just dismiss this view out of hand. And the reason I did that was because the main sources that I consulted in studying this issue were preterist sources. I love to read the other side. I really want to understand them. I hope that comes through. And that's why I'm just so thankful whenever people say, hey, you have to read this person on this, or you have to interact with this person. I love that. I actually want to deal with the best arguments. Okay. So keep those coming. Those of you who hate me or want to, challenge me or debunk me, send me the best. I love it. That really helps me, and I'm thankful for that. So I used to only read like the DeMar, the Kenneth Gentry, I'd listen to Durbin and things like that. And so they would just speak disparagingly of this view. And I was like, yeah, that's dumb. Like this has to refer to a period of time, a 30 or 40 year time period for a generation. That makes most sense. Why would you take it any differently? And now I have to admit that I actually lean heavily toward this view that I'm going to describe now, and I'm going to describe why that is through the evidence, and a lot of it has to do with even Meyer's work and his dissertation tracing a lot of these things. But I think the first question you need to ask then is, what is the semantic range for the word generation? All right, that's the first question. Is if generation cannot mean this collective reference to Israel, the family of Israel, this collective reference to their sin, then it's just debunked immediately, right? So a semantic range of a word deals with, what it can possibly mean in contexts. And I think part of the problem for me was that I think a lot of preterists probably have this problem too. I think we're very hung up on our English definition of generation. Okay. And so I'm going to the Oxford Learner's Dictionary here, the Oxford Learner's Dictionary. And so just reading through the definitions here, as you can see, the first definition is all the people who were born at about the same time. Okay. So that's the first one. The second one is the average time in which children grow up, become adults, and have children of their own, usually considered to be about 30 years. Okay. And that is number 2. Number 3 is a single stage in the history of a family. All right. So, thinking about 5 generations of farmers, family units, etc. Or a group of people of similar age involved in a particular activity. Maybe that could be like Generation Z, maybe. I don't know. And then you have number 5, a stage in the development of a product. So Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3, talking about different products. And then the production of something. So it's the generation of electricity, the methods of income generation, etc. And that's it. So they're all, in the English speaking world, we don't really have a category for using generation as a synonym for family or nation, basically, right? I think that makes sense. We don't have that in our access. But in Meyer's dissertation, so again, I had read mostly preterists on this, and so then I, was reading through Meyer's dissertation, just wanted to get a view of it. And one of the things that I noticed was that he did a really good job using the TLG. Now, what is TLG? So that's the Greek thesaurus. It's basically the database where all the Greek sources are stored. So it's a really remarkable resource. They have it all tagged and all these things. You can do some intense Greek language searches and studies. So he had mentioned in his dissertation that there was close to 8,500 uses of this word. Genea in Greek is what it's called, and that's the word that we typically are translating as generation. So 8,500 uses. Okay, so lots of opportunities to explore it, and he didn't look at all of them. Obviously, that he probably would have died if he tried to do that. He'd still be doing it, but he basically fine-tuned it to he was trying to focus on mainly 2 centuries, the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD. So about a 200-year time span, and he limited his searches there. So he's basically working through all those data sets, and he records it in his dissertation. And again, I don't know what the book is going to look like when it comes out. I'm excited for it. I hope to interview him on the podcast and talk about that. But in the dissertation, there were a lot of really good tables for the Greek, and if you don't know Greek, there would have been some difficulty for that, I think. But we'll see what the book looks like. But in any case, just really excited about his research, and he basically concluded that in looking through the time period around the Gospels and the time of Jesus, that Genea had a wide range of meanings. And this is his quote. I thought it was helpful to just say it in his own words, is that he said, Genea was used of temporal contemporaries, but this was not its only meaning or its most common meaning. Okay, so again, in looking through the English dictionary there, we don't have an alternative category for generation. But what Meyer's saying is that in the Greek-speaking world, there was actually a very significant alternative set of meanings for this term. And so as I looked through the data, I'll just have to say I was happy but sad at the same time, because I felt like I'd been lied to a little bit by the preterists. They didn't acknowledge that this was a common understanding of the word Genea. And so whatever, it's my fault for not checking other sources. I get that. But I really appreciate the work of Meyer. And as he was working through his dissertation, one of the things that I came away with looking at his research was that in order to differentiate between if Genea is used temporally or if it is used as a qualitative marker. If it's, and by when I say qualitative, I mean it's talking about a family, it's talking about a race, it's talking about a group of animals, it's talking about, those things. When you're trying to differentiate whether it's temporal or qualitative, those are the two categories that Meyer gives, and I appreciate that. If it's temporal, the word is going to be used with time markers, unsurprisingly. So usually numerical adjectives, like the third generation, the fourth generation, like in the Old Testament, he will not allow the guilty to go unpunished. Third and fourth generation, he talks about there. So in general, that makes good sense. You have possibly a specific time span listed for an amount of years. The seventh generation, or after 40 years, the generation arose, something like that. So timing language is very, very key to understanding temporal nuance. You can also have the plural use of the Greek term, generations, and if the generations as plural is used, then it's usually talking about successive timing and generation, right? And then there's also ideas of what we could talk about chronological progression, right? So if talk about, this generation, if you want to use that terminology, this generation lived for 40 years and then the next generation arose, or something like that. There are very progressive elements in a story. You can easily tell those things. But like Meyer noted, there are quite a significant amount of alternative explanations for this. And Genea can also be used qualitatively. And I loved his data on this. And so basically, as I'm taking notes and working through some of that, one of the things that he points out is that if you see Genea used with family terms, or with an emphasis on offspring or children, those are key indicators that this is a qualitative emphasis. So, for example, if you had something, they are the Genea of Abraham, well, that would be synonym essentially for children or something like that. And what's also interesting about this is that adjectives, when adjectives are modifying the generation, qualitative adjectives, they're also pointing to a qualitative nature of Genea itself. So when adjectives, and he looks through the study, adjectives like wicked, rebellious, male, female, and by the way, Genea also, I just remembered this thinking about male and female, is that Genea also is referenced by Meyer as being used, or Genea is used to reference genders as well. So groups or characteristics that qualify a group, that is a legitimate understanding of Genea. National identities are also used that way. So yeah, I just think, again, I looking at the dissertation, the material, I think he did a great job. And I was kind of surprised at that, because I was pretty much set in stone that I would just take a futuristic approach of the Olivet Discourse and see, and it still might be true, but I'm just saying I lean a lot more now toward that qualitative approach based on, his dissertation and how well done it was. And, I think that given his parameters and the discussions and the evidence that he brought forward, I think at least it needs to be taken seriously as a possible consideration. Now, arguing for this view, then, I would say one of the biggest things that jumps out is now the entire discussion shifts. Because now if you look at how Matthew uses the terminology of generation, you actually see that he uses it in line with all these parameters. So Matthew 11:16 talks about the generation being compared with wicked children, right? You have Matthew 12:36 or 12:39, excuse me. The generation is an evil and adulterous generation. 12:45 is an evil generation. 16:4 is an evil and adulterous generation. And then 17:17 is a faithless and twisted generation. So a lot of descriptors which point to a qualitative understanding of generation. And here was one of the things I was most happy to see, I suppose, was with regard to Deuteronomy 32. So I So one of the common themes in Matthean studies, can I use that as a term? Matthean studies is the theme of a new Exodus, okay? And the new Exodus theme has been recognized in so many capacities. It's basically just everyone assumes it now. It doesn't need to be proven. Jesus is solidifying himself, positioning himself as a new Moses, and he's basically, leading the people out of the promised land into a new Exodus of sorts. And that's basically one of the theses of Meyer's dissertation, is talking about how our understanding of this generation and that issue involved coincides with the new Exodus motif. And I think he did a really good job. And one of the components as we walk through that is that Deuteronomy specifically has a very strong parallel with this generation, Deuteronomy 32 specifically. Okay. And so what is Deuteronomy 32? So Deuteronomy 32 is a song that was designed to be composed for the benefit of Israel, talking about their future. Okay. In Deuteronomy 31, verse 19, I'm going to bring this up on the screen, and it says, "Now therefore write this song and teach it to the people of Israel. Put it in their mouths, that this song may be a witness for me against the people of Israel. For when I have brought them into the land flowing with milk and honey, which I swore to give to their fathers, and they have eaten and are full and grown fat, they will turn to other gods and serve them." Now, I've mentioned this before. It's been a long time since I've done a Deuteronomy episode, but this idea of Israel's impending rebellion was very present in Deuteronomy even before they rebelled. So Moses, again, is saying this here, or God saying it through Moses. "They'll despise me and break my covenant." And then in verse 21, when many evils come upon them, when many evils and troubles come upon them, this song shall confront them as a witness. Okay, so the purpose of this song is that, it's kind of like, I don't know, in English we have London Bridge is falling down or whatever. Well, we know that song. There's not really a life lesson, but almost everybody knows it, right? Just because. And so this was the goal of this song, is to get everybody to know this, know these words, know these truths, so that when they were going through something, they would be able to say, this is what God had told us. Okay. And so the song itself is kind of a prophetic template saying this is what you're going to go through and this is what you need to remember. And there are two verses in particular that are very helpful. And one is verse 5. So they have dealt corruptly with him. This is talking about Israel dealing with Yahweh. And again, remember, this isn't about the current generation, if you want to use that temporal understanding. This isn't about the current people that Moses was dealing with, because they were actually going to enter into the land of promise and be faithful temporarily. But it's talking about a people that are going to be future. So notice it talks about in the present, it says, they have dealt corruptly with him. They are no longer his children because they are blemished. They are a crooked and twisted generation. So a qualitative nuance there of generation. And in verse 20, he says, "And he said, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end will be, for they are a perverse generation, children in whom is no faithfulness." Okay. Now, if you're here, I'm just going to show you, if you're watching, hopefully you're all here, but if you're watching, I'm just going to highlight two words here, because you have ex estromene in Greek. So that's the perverse generation. And then the sons without faith. Okay. Now, if you go to Matthew 17, notice the descriptions that are used there are faithless and twisted generation. All right. And I'm going to bring that up in Greek just because if you can read Greek, or if you want to see, notice it is the faithless, and it's the same word built on the same root. So extrepho versus diastrepho, and the same root with faith. It's just with the alpha primitive, the apistos instead of pistos. And so basically what that means is that, and I think most people acknowledge this, is that basically Matthew 17:17 has a huge, strong tie-in to Deuteronomy 32 as a faithless and twisted generation, as a faithless and perverted generation. And so if you are keeping track at home then, and you're saying, well, what does that mean then actually? Well, I think it's a very clear connection between this qualitative idea that Israel was being treated cumulatively. They were building up this weight of judgment, and Jesus was speaking to them, the people that he was talking to, during that Passion Week especially, he's talking to them and saying, you are this generation, the same generation that existed, in the past and will continue to exist in the future. You're rebellious, you're hard-hearted, you're twisted, you're perverted. Remember the Deuteronomy 32, remember that Deuteronomic song that said you were continuing to rebel, you were rejecting God's plan, all these things. It still is true for you. You need to repent from this. And so there's a huge tie in there. And that really does fit very nicely with the theme of Matthew, by the way. And so I think that makes a lot of sense. And from a biblical theological standpoint, that fits very well with the corporate understanding of Israel, Israel's identity corporately, how they just keep filling up sins upon, in their identity as God's chosen people. They keep filling up the sins. And in fact, I remember meditating on this earlier in some other issue. In Exodus 32, the people of Israel, they said, they had the sin of the golden calf. And then in Exodus 32, God says, I'm not going to judge them, but in the day that I do visit the people, I will visit their sins upon them. And so in other words, it was now that didn't happen during their life. It was, in my opinion, a foreshadowing, a foretaste of an expectation that there is going to come a day in the future when I pour out all of my wrath upon them, upon this generation of Israel. Now, I think full preterists would say that all takes place in 70 AD, but again, that doesn't make any sense, really, from a New Testament perspective or Old Testament perspective. All right, so you have the qualitative nature being found all throughout Scripture. It seems to be found very present in Matthew, and there's also a huge, strong connection in Deuteronomy 32, specifically, kind of painting the paradigm and the pattern of, these are some of the language and descriptions that Jesus himself uses. The people would have been sensitive to those kinds of things. Now, I'd also like to point out, and some of that stuff, a lot of that stuff comes from Meyer, but one of the things that I would also add here, this is maybe a fourth line of reasoning, is that this fits very well with what I would call the Transgenerational You pattern of prophecy, the pattern of prophecy. So in prophetic templates, we're talking Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, there is often a pattern for for Moses or Isaiah or whatever prophet to speak to the current, audience that he's talking about, but to speak through them, whether it be to the past or to the future. When Moses is speaking to the people of Israel, he says, you were there when God made the covenant. Well, they weren't there. Maybe a few of them were, maybe half of them were, but many of them were not. Or in Deuteronomy, when he says, you will rebel against God, you will worship false idols, you will be brought into exile. Well, obviously, everybody acknowledges it's kind of like it's assumed by people. It's often not even given thought, but if you think about it analytically, it is a speaking through the generation that is going on there. And what's really important is that Matthew 23 follows that same pattern. Okay. And so I'm going to bring up Matthew 23 and verse 29, because that's kind of the start of this section. And he says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets, you decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers. Now notice that corporate language then, fill up then the measure of your fathers. In other words, he's connecting them to their past descendants, right? So already then we have a, tie in with what we had talked about earlier, is that there's a connection between that current generation and their past generations. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore, I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some who you will flog in your synagogues, persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Barachiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Now, notice, you murdered him. Now, is that true? No, it is not true, at least with regard to, the calendar. These people were not even alive yet. This was 700 some years earlier, okay? So 700 some years earlier, Zechariah dies. I think I have that right. But Jesus is telling them, you murdered Zechariah, right? This was your sin. It was your culpable. And so then in verse 36, he says, truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So there's obviously a corporate familial element here. And one of the things to point out is that in Matthew 23, verse 36, when he's saying all these things will come upon this generation, he's clearly speaking to Israel as a corporate identity. That's absolutely clear. And so it makes sense then, in my understanding of things, that this generation of Matthew 24 is also going to be used the exact same way as Matthew 23. I mean, they're just, a chapter apart, and the context is the exact same because the disciples are actually asking about this. Okay. And so Jesus continues this corporate address, this transgenerational address, and he says in verse 37, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it, how often I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. Or how often would I have gathered, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And of course, a couple observations there. One would be, again, they're being addressed as a corporate entity, but two, there's a promise of blessing, right? Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. They will say that, and that's when they're going to see the Christ. When is that going to take place? Well, it's going to come later, after the tribulation, when Christ comes and when he gathers the elect, right? That is what's going to take place, just schedule-wise. I mean, Jesus is making that point pretty clearly. And then you have Matthew 24, where the disciples are asking, when will all these things be, that you're talking about? And so there's a huge connection there. So in Matthew 23, we have the transgenerational pattern that fits with the other Old Testament prophecies. Again, Old Testament patterns, Jesus isn't doing anything new. He's continuing on with the prophetic patterns that we saw in the Old Testament, right? And so when you understand that, it starts to give further credence to the idea that this reference to this generation would be qualitative, a reference to Israel's familial identity as a rebellious clan against the Messiah, right? And then we already talked about this, so I'm not going to go into detail of this, but obviously the huge elephant in the room is the futuristic signs of Matthew 24. I already talked about how they don't work with preterism, and they work with the futuristic view. So I won't go into that, but it would fit either the temporal or the qualitative view for the future temporal, or the qualitative view referencing Israel. Okay. And then also one other final point, which is kind of, I think this is helpful to point out too, is that the qualitative view would make, I think, a little better logical coherence with Matthew 24:36. So Matthew 24:36 says, concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. Okay. And so this is a weird tension, if you will, because if we take Matthew 24:34 as a temporal reference, basically what he would be saying is that, and this is the huge problem for the preterists, is that Jesus is saying, I want you to know for sure that I'm coming back within 40 years, but no one knows, no man, no, not even I, nobody knows when I'm coming back. You're just like, what? That would be, I mean, illustration wise, it's kind of like if I were to say, well, I can promise you that we are going on vacation this month, but no man knows what day or hour we're going, but I can promise you it's going to be this month. It's like, well, that kind of loses some rhetorical power, if you know what I'm saying. And I think the futuristic camp can deal better with that because they say, well, in the nobody knows in the future when this is going to happen, but once it starts, then you know that it's all going to take place very quickly within a generation. But if you take the preterist perspective, you're basically saying, it's all this is going to happen within, 40 years, within 30, 40 years, but no one knows when it's going to happen. You're just like, well, that is kind of soft. Like that really is, I think that's a more significant challenge than preterists often will admit, because it really kind of, makes verse 36 meaningless in many ways. So I think that's a problem. Futurists don't have as much of a problem, but I just think in general, this is an argument for the qualitative approach, because in one sense, it alleviates all that tension of having a temporal reference in verse 34. If you think it's a temporal reference, then you have a anti-temporal verse right after it. And so that's a tension that's absolved by taking the qualitative view as well. So I think that's another argument for it. Again, it's not slam dunk. I don't think if you take a futuristic temporal view that you're going to be, out to lunch with no solutions. But I think it is something worth considering. So anyway, wow, I'm looking at the time and we have covered a lot of material there. So, okay, if I can just summarize and rank the views, I would say preterism obviously has, the most difficulties and most significant problems. The best thing for preterism today is that they have a lot of people on social media going for them, and there's a lot of emotionalism behind it. But objectively, there's just not much to it. Apologetically, people want to use that kind of stuff to, say, look, the Bible is true. We know that because of this. And so I get that. I just don't think objectively there's much of an argument for preterism. And again, I'm not saying there couldn't be certain elements within 70 AD that are fulfilled there. I think that we should be open to that. But by and large, most of the Olivet Discourse would be unrelated to those events, especially the references to the coming of Christ. I think that's very, very important to understand. And if you'll notice, the explanations that I gave could hypothetically even work with like an amillennial viewpoint. And I don't know, maybe there's a way to make postmillennialism work with it, but preterism, the belief that like the entirety of the Olivet Discourse already took place, really just has to suffer, because that's just a very unlikely view, given all of the evidence exegetically with Scripture. And yeah, I just think there's too many problems with that. And I think the futuristic understanding of this generation is better. I think it's very acceptable. Like I said, I used to heavily lean that way. Now given the fact that I've actually studied the usages of Guinea and how it's different than English, and how it is used to reference collective groups that have certain qualities about them. Now I'm more open to that. And I think Meyer's dissertation and soon-to-be book will be very helpful and a great benefit to the church on that. And so hopefully I'll be able to get him on the podcast and we can talk more about that. But I know I've been requested many times for this episode, so I hope it's helpful for people in thinking through these issues. And if it's not, you can always tell me I am a loser and I don't know what I'm talking about, because I always love to hear that too. But maybe we can do some follow-ups at a future date. I do have a schedule that I'm trying to keep to for recording certain kinds of episodes, but Lord willing, this will be helpful to you. You can always reach out to me through the comments on YouTube or through the contact form on my website, peteryeaman.com. You can read some of the articles I've written there. And if you're interested in finding out more about me or Shepherd's Theological Seminary, where I teach, you can visit shepherds.edu. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and make his face shine upon you.